In this video lecture, we are going to cover some of the founding moments in international relations. The purpose of this is twofold. In the first place, we want to situate IR in the historical context that shaped its creation, as well as specific perspectives that were developed in reaction to real-world events. In the second place, understanding these world events is crucial to understanding today's real-world events. The 20th century was of that big of a fundamental significance to the world order, as well as to the way that we study it. A brief overview of the developments in international politics in the 20th century shows just how monumental a century it was. For one thing, it was the bloodiest 100-year period in known history. One reason for this was the age of industrialization in which it occurred. Technology in war became more precise and deadlier. This was the time of the advent of machine guns, tanks, chemical weapons, and nuclear bombs. The period also saw staggering campaigns to eradicate entire political, religious, or ethnic groups, also known as genocide. The Holocaust, the USSR under Stalin, Mao's campaigns to destroy political opponents of the revolution in China, Pol Pot's similar campaign in Cambodia, the Indonesian genocide to destroy communists, the Armenian genocide at the hands of the Turkish state, and later in the century, the Rwandan and Guatemalan genocides. And in the last half of the century, most events were influenced by decolonization and or the Cold War. These two things also impacted one another. And the Cold War's end brought along with it new concerns, many of them stemming from decolonization, as identity politics becomes more of a question domestically and internationally. These identity politics take different shapes in different contexts. In the United States, identity politics are wrapped up in gender, race, and language. And in decolonizing countries, the question of identity may be a matter of ethnicity, tribal affiliation, and also language, and also religion. The warlike character of the 20th century was especially exceptional after a relatively peaceful 19th century. The religious wars had largely ended, and previously warlike kingdoms were now focused on the project of state building as the large empires declined. During this period of state building, nationalism was strongly on the rise, which these days signals a potential conflict ahead. The League of Nations was based on a centuries-old principle of kings called collective security. In the days of Henry VIII, kingdoms might form alliances with one another that hinged on the agreement that if one of these kingdoms were attacked, its allies would retaliate and come to its aid. The League of Nations hoped to maintain the multipolar balance of power that existed in Europe during the 19th century, but it was not to be. The existing nationalism combined with the Great Depression led to a polarization of European societies, with both the far right and the far left gaining traction among populations. This was a recipe for the intense interstate war that would begin when Hitler began violating the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that had demilitarized Germany, forcing them to take responsibility for World War I and imposing on them harsh reparations that created dire economic crises during the Great Depression. Under these conditions, fascism rose and led to the Holocaust. At the same time, the Southeast Asian region was embroiled in centuries-long conflicts that left China and Japan bitterly opposed to one another and also led to the creation of the island cities of Hong Kong and Taiwan, which international institutions struggle today to classify and negotiate with due to China's insistence of ownership. Combined, the casualties of World War II amounted to 50 million people dying. During the Cold War, political scientists argued that the major world wars could be avoided under the new bipolar balance of power. But what caused the Cold War, which leads to the balance of power? The USSR had, after all, been allies against the Axis powers in the Second World War, but they did not have positive relations afterwards. The demise of their mutual enemy left them the most powerful countries in the world, and the governments held deeply different ideologies. Both were also extremely ambitious and wanted to influence the decolonizing countries. The U.S. devoted many resources to containment of the Soviet spread. This policy was put forth by U.S. diplomat George Kennan in 1947, and the idea is given wider application in the Truman Doctrine, which sought to provide active protection and support for free peoples threatened by subversion within or pressures without. This became the justification for U.S. support of a variety of right-wing regimes around the world who only claimed to be freedom-loving, all because they were virulently anti-communist. This led to the U.S. covertly and overtly intervening in places like Chile, Peru, Vietnam, Guatemala, Iran, and Iraq, among others. A more successful policy was the Marshall Plan, devised by the U.S. to help recover Europe with grants and credits given to countries in the region. These totaled more than $13 billion. Between 1948 and 1952, the plan's achievements had exceeded expectations, with industrial production rising to 35% and agricultural production to 10% above the pre-war levels. This aid had enormous benefits to the U.S. economy because it stimulated significant markets for its exports. The Marshall Plan also laid out the means for the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which were planned at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. The idea was to create a strong Western Europe that could withstand threats from the USSR. The creation of NATO was one way to reach this goal, but it was also sparked by the Berlin crisis. The city had been divided into occupation zones at the end of the war, with the US and UK controlling the west and the USSR controlling the east. The USSR blockaded all land routes from the west into the city, and the U.S. and the U.K. airlifted vital supplies into their sectors. The Warsaw Pact laid out the plans for East Germany to be controlled by the USSR, and for some time, migration between the two sides of the city were allowed, but this ended in 1961 with the construction of the Berlin Wall. The Second World War ended a bit later in the Pacific, and the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, both to definitively end the war and to display power greater than the USSR had displayed. This began the arms race and the nuclear fear that characterized most of the 20th century. The Cold War saw several international conflicts that reflected the ideological tensions between the two world powers. In 1949, the communist power in China defeated pro-nationalist, pro-Western forces led by Chiang Kai-shek, who retreated to Taiwan. China did not establish close ties to Russia, and so did not qualify as the type of enemy as the USSR, but it did contribute to wars between communists and non-communists in Korea and Vietnam, which resulted in over 86,000 U.S. soldiers losing their lives. And this leads to Vietnam Syndrome, which was a U.S. policy position limiting the circumstances in which U.S. troops might be committed to fighting conflicts abroad. While no large-scale war broke out during this time, there are numerous smaller conflicts that the U.S. supported in countries like Iran, Indonesia, Brazil, Nicaragua, where anti-communist forces received support from the U.S. The U.S. also intervened covertly in places like the Congo to have elected leaders that did not conform to U.S. policy assassinated. This was particularly destabilizing to countries that were only now establishing their first independent institutions of government. The Iran-Contra affair is one of these striking cases. There was a secret arms deal with Iran at a time when Iran was at war with Iraq, which the government of the U.S. was actually supporting, and contrary to a policy to not supply any government sponsoring terrorism. There was a secret deal to release 7 U.S. hostages being held in Lebanon by Hezbollah, and the channeling of funds from the sale of arms to right-wing rebels in Nicaragua seeking to overthrow a left-wing government there, despite a congressional act prohibiting funding the rebels. The Third World emerges as an important entity in the IR at this time. By the way, this is still used to refer today to poor countries with low standards of living, but it was originally meant to refer to the chronology of when they entered the state system. The term was also meant to denote that they were not aligned with either the Western capitalist or the Soviet bloc. The Third World countries formed the non-aligned movement, whose origins go back to 1961 when countries Egypt, Indonesia, India, and Yugoslavia founded it. Members still had close ties with one another or the other major power bloc because of economic necessity. Cuba was a member, for example, and still has close ties with the USSR. While the influence of these blocs wasn't completely avoided, it still exists and today has 120 members and meets every 3 to 4 years at summits. There are a lot of contradictions that are involved in NOM, like the focus they have on foreign oppression, even though some of the members are extremely repressive governments. Generally, death and misery due to the international conflict of the Cold War, as well as civil wars, were a main feature of the Cold War period. These smaller and proxy wars, where the U.S. was fighting the USSR or vice versa by supporting certain governments militarily, these were more common than hot war. This was largely avoided during this period, it is believed, because of MAD, or mutually assured destruction. The assurance of second strike capabilities changed the calculations that governments had to make regarding dropping these fatal weapons. These weapons do untold environmental damage on top of extremely high immediate death rates. The Cold War ended as the blockade against the USSR eventually caused their markets to saturate and collapse, which led to movements throughout their region rebelling and having no fear of Soviet reprisal. With the end of the Cold War, some scholars, most notably Francis Fukuyama, argued that the final step in creating a capitalist, democratic world system had been taken and that we were, to coin a phrase, at the end of history. This led momentarily to a rash of optimistic publications by IR scholars that championed notions from the democratic peace. And you see this view as well as international organization efforts to spread democracy during this time. For example, the Gulf War of 1991, led by the U.S. against Iraq, NATO's war against Serbia over Kosovo in 1999, the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the first phase of the War on Terror, in other words, and the subsequent invasion of Iraq in 2003, again led by the U.S., as well as the intervention in Libya in 2011, consisting mainly of NATO forces. All of these were prosecuted by alliances led by liberal democracies. Another important development in the post-Cold War period was the expulsion of Iraq from Kuwait by an alliance of forces under a UN Security Council mandate in 1991. This regenerated the general mood of euphoria that had followed the collapse of the Berlin Wall, at least among the Western alliance. In the absence of the old polarization in world politics, it seemed that the collective security function of the UN could at last be fulfilled. There was a very evident revival of idealist aspirations, reflected in visions of a new world order based on effective international law and backed up by the sanction of the UN's apparent newfound solidarity. But this vision was challenged by another characterization of the post-Cold War order by a scholar who took issues with some of Fukuyama's ideas. The idea of a clash of civilizations was put forward in 1993 by Samuel Huntington. While agreeing that the old ideological battles between communism and liberal democracy were indeed over, he argued that there was little cause for complacency about other potential sources of conflict, nor was the world about to be unified under a single civilizational umbrella based on widespread commitment to Western values. Huntington declared that the fundamental source of conflict in the new post-Cold War world would emerge from the great cultural divisions among humankind. While nation-states would remain powerful actors in world affairs, the principal conflicts would occur between nations and groups of different civilizations. The clash of civilizations will dominate global politics, and the fault lines between civilizations will be the battle lines of the future, wrote Huntington. Furthermore, in the politics of civilizations, the peoples and governments of non-Western civilizations no longer remain the objects of history as targets of Western colonialism, but join the West as movers and shapers of history. Huntington identified 8 major civilizational groupings: Western, Confucian, Japanese, Islamic, Hindu, and Slavic Orthodox, Latin American, and possibly African. There were several points about why civilizations were likely to clash. The first is that religion, history, culture, and other relevant parts of identity are centuries old and fundamental to societies, so they evoke a lot of emotion when challenged. Second, since the world is becoming a smaller place, the interactions between people of different civilizations are increasing, which has the effect of intensifying civilization consciousness. Third, economic modernization and social change throughout the world are weakening long-standing local identities as well as the nation-state as a source of identity. In many places, religion has moved in to fill the vacuum, often taking the form of fundamentalist movements. This creates yet another dimension of identity politics. Fourth, the West has a dual role in enhancing civilizational consciousness. Since the West is the world's dominant culture, there are often counter-movements, return to the roots phenomena among non-Western civilizations that seek to distinguish themselves from the West. Fifth, cultural differences are less mutable and easily compromised. It is not as simple as changing your party affiliation. Finally, increasing economic regionalism reinforces civilizational consciousness, and agreements and cooperation are increasingly based on shared culture, not shared state status, which holds together most international and domestic institutions in the West. Therefore, NAFTA and the EU require a state form to continue to exist in this static form. but the expansion of economic relations among Asians is largely proceeding because of their shared culture. Huntington has been heavily criticized for being incredibly culturally insensitive and oversimplifying the world's cultures. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, Huntington's work got more attention because he had focused on a potential conflict between the Muslim world and the West, and this seemed to be an example of his thesis. However, the author here, Lawson, makes a significant point that the problem is not the difference between the practices of Islam and the West, but really due to a growth in fundamental forms of religion of all types, Buddhist, Hindu, and Christian included. Huntington does seem to have been popular because of identifying culture as a point of conflict, because that seemed to characterize the smaller scale conflicts that had erupted around the world due to decolonization and the Cold War. These included the breakup of the state of Yugoslavia and wars between Catholics and Muslims in Serbia and Bosnia during the 1990s. The culture concept was popular in the 90s because it seemed to explain a lot, and it sparked conversations about ethnocentrism in world politics and international relations. Member states in the UN and scholars alike began to resist the notion that human rights and democracy were best defined by the dominant culture of the West, and their writings reflect a bit less pro-Western views than Huntington or Fukuyama. For example, writings on the success of the, quote, Asian miracle that talks about the growth of Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China economically over the past 3 decades often resorts to praise of the Asian values, Confucianism, or some other influence that is seen as making Asian people more disciplined and productive. However, in spite of this Asian exceptionalism, the region is still rife with human rights abuses. Nonetheless, the idea that Western values are not the only ones that can be associated with paths to success is a form of progress in cultural awareness. To conclude, the 20th century warfare provided the impetus for the founding of IR as a distinct discipline and the basis from which the theorizing that we know today was initiated. This continued throughout the Cold War period, although traditional theoretical approaches, including liberalism and realism, began to be challenged. The post-Cold War period has been especially conducive to new developments in thinking about international politics.